That's a nice one.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at Allan Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Worcestertown. It's such a pleasure to have all of you here joining us here, both physically as well as virtually, for the launch of Obstetrics, Gynecology and Reproductive Sciences in Manitoba, a history, published by Heartland Associates. We're very grateful to Heartland for not only publishing the book, but helping to bring this evening together. You won't have to tolerate my presence for very long. I will be back at the end just to go over a few notes about signing procedure. And the only thing I'll make note about right now is that at the close of the event, we'll ask you to remain in place for one moment while we transport Allan across the store to a table immediately beside the cash desk where he'll be signing copies of tonight's volume. I'll have a few more thrilling notes about signing procedure for you at the end of the event itself. With that in mind, I now have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker tonight. When Dr. Mary Jane Seeger was the department head for the Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of Manitoba, she felt the need to produce a historical account of their specialty and approached Allan Levine. As they say, the rest is history. Dr. Seeger was the department head from 2017 to 2022, retiring on September 2nd of this year. Dr. Seeger was pleased to be able to wind up the book project, which culminates in this launch this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Jane Seeger.
Thank you so much. Good evening. Thank you all for coming to this exciting event, the launch of our book relating the history of obstetrics and gynecology in Manitoba. Years ago, by that I mean pre-COVID, I happened past the university bookstore and saw a copy of the anesthesia book about their history. It caught my attention because of a picture on the cover of Dr. John Wade, a previous department head for anesthesia. Dean Wade, as he is known to us of the class of '85, is an important part of mine and many other medical education. For that reason, I bought their book, and the germ of an idea of a book of our own had taken seed. Thanks to those who inspired and helped along this journey, to those of you who have had their stories told before, Dr. Christodulu from the Department of Anesthesia, Dr. Mark Goresic, Department of Radiology, for support and advice from Dr. Richard Warditsky, for writing the foreword and agreeing what a fascinating read, Dr. Brian Postal, to many department members who agreed to be interviewed and to help to flesh out the story of the work that we do. To everyone from Heartland and at Friesens involved in the publishing, editing, and printing, this has been a truly made in Manitoba project. And of course, Mr. Allan Levine, who without his research and writing expertise, this book would not be here tonight. Allan is an author and historian with a PhD from the University of Toronto. He has written 16 books, which you can read listed on the poster for this evening's launch. He's won various awards, long listed for the RBC Taylor Prize, has won the Alexander Kennedy Isbister Award for Nonfiction, and has won the McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award. He's also the author of the Department of Anesthesia, University of Manitoba, a 50-year retrospective history, and Manitoba Radiology, the first 125 years. For the past 12 years, he's written the column Now and Then for the Winnipeg Free Press, which looks at the history behind major news events. His articles and reviews have also appeared in the Globe and Mail, the National Post, the Toronto Star, and Maclean's, and other publications. Thank you again, Allan, for undertaking our project. I did assure you that this would be interesting, and I hope that you agree. So, Mr. Allan Levine.
Hi, thank you for coming. Let me just start by saying, first of all, that this book was a labor of love, and I delivered it in 9 months. No, that was but I tried to deliver to 9 months. There was one big push at the end, and then the book was born. This is my third history of the University of Manitoba, a medical department, as Mary Jane had said. I've learned a lot. My mother wanted me to be a doctor, and though I am a doctor, it isn't quite what she had in mind. But now with books on OBGYN and anesthesia and radiology, I am now a full-service doctor. I can, for a female patient, I can do the ultrasound, monitor anesthesia for a C-section, and just deliver the baby, no complications. Of course, it isn't that simple, but I have learned a lot. I'd like to thank Dr. Seeger, the former head of the department, as well as Dr. Richard Barditsky, who I've known since I was a teenager through our mutual association with Cam Assad. Richard's couldn't be here tonight because he's been living in Vancouver. He's a longtime member whose fascinating career I chronicle in the book. They both recruited me to write this history. I'd also like to thank all the physicians, past and present, who took the time to speak with me about their work, including the current head, Dr. Vanessa Poliquin and Dr. Margaret Burnett, who were great interviews and provided me with numerous photographs. And I'd also like to single out two stellar administrative assistants who work in the department, Dale Shader and Cheryl Nichols, for helping me track down and arrange interviews with very busy doctors. This is no easy task, trust me. Thanks once more to Marjolaine Hebert, who's here, Marjo Speaks, who did great work transcribing interviews. Hilary McMahon's my literary agent in Toronto, for always looking after my best interests, as she's done for more than 15 years. To Barbara Huck, Peter St. John, and everyone in Heartland Associates, and Kendra Jacob Esvedo of Jacob Design for another great job with the publication process. And to Shannon Levine, my daughter-in-law, is also here, for her stellar copy editing on the draft of the manuscript and for tolerating my frequent pun emails to her. I'd also like to mention my children and grandchildren, or some of them are here, for their support and inspiration, and my wife, Angie. Angie's medical knowledge and professional experience as a nurse in obstetrics and gynecology and as a public health nurse was particularly helpful in this project. I'd also like to comment just briefly on two developments in the history of OBGYN in Manitoba that you can find in the book. As in most medical specialties in the past 150 years, advances in medicine and technology have been remarkable and positive in obstetrics and gynecology. At one time, maternal mortality and infant mortality were frighteningly high. Prenatal care was almost non-existent. Doctors didn't wear gloves or even wash their hands or wear a mask, and mothers died of an infection, puerperal fever. C-sections were even more dangerous. In Canada, 700 women, for example, died in 1901, and 1,206 20 years later, when the population had grown substantially. According to a study conducted by a woman named Dr. Helen McMurtry, she was a pioneering Toronto physician and actually a dedicated supporter of eugenics, for the period from July 1925 to July 1926, showed that there had been 1,532 maternal deaths in Canada, and that many of those had occurred in Manitoba. She calculated that Canada's maternal mortality rate was 6.4 per 1,000 live births, while in Manitoba it was 7.7. I should note that in this period of time, more women died from, and people died from tuberculosis than childbirth. The Medical Association was sufficiently concerned that it appointed a committee chairman chaired by obstetrician and gynecologist Ross Mitchell to investigate further. He found that the numbers to be better than McMurtry had noted. Nonetheless, Mitchell concurred that women in Manitoba and elsewhere in the country were dying from puerperal fever and eclampsia, as well as of prenatal and postnatal care, an issue emphasized by McMurtry. In those days, most obstetricians did not pay sufficient attention to diabetes, high blood pressure, or other high-risk factors that could lead to a severe outcome during delivery. That was an area that Mitchell, who with his colleague John McQueen was already running a weekly prenatal clinic, encouraged his colleagues to address. Positive change did happen, however, an acceptance of the absolute importance of preventing infection during delivery and the advancement of obstetrical medicine to levels not thought possible during Mitchell's day has almost eliminated maternal mortality in Canada. Consider that in 2018, there were 31 maternal deaths and 1 late maternal death in Canada, with a population nearly 4 times that as great as in 1928. Nearly 70% of these women died from complications mainly related to the early postpartum period and postpartum hemorrhage. From 2009 to 2019, the Canadian maternal mortality rate was as low as 4.5 deaths per 100,000 live births and as high as 8.7. Still terrible, of course, but nothing like it had been a century ago when there were 4.2 deaths per 1,000 live births in Manitoba from 1936 to 40. Prenatal and postnatal care are now routine, and the development of such subspecialties as fetal maternal medicine, gynecological oncology, female endocrinology, infertility, family planning, gynecological urology and adolescent gynecology, and treating high-risk pregnancy factors like diabetes and high blood pressure have enhanced women's health care in a multitude of ways. The other key issue I wanted to highlight is the transformation of the specialty, a transformation that occurred only within probably about the last 3 decades or so. There are now more female members of the department than men. This has been a national, international trend and a possibility that was raised as early as the 1930s, when the number of female obstetricians and gynecologists was very tiny. It took 80 years to become a reality. In 1995, of the approximately 1,700 obstetricians and gynecologists in Canada, about 24% were women. If you fast forward more than 2 decades and the situation's been turned upside down, as of 2019, there were 2,230 Canadian obstetricians and gynecologists, of whom 1,382 or 62% were women. In the US, more than 80% of OBGYN residents are female. The U of M department has followed this trend. As of October 2021, there are 89 members and 62, or nearly 70% of them, are women. The appointment in 2006 of Dr. Maggie Morris, who is back there as head of the department, followed by Dr. Seeger in 2017, and now Dr. Vanessa Poliquin, decades after Eleanor Black became the first female head, is further proof of this dramatic shift. Not to detract from any of the physicians, and they're all fascinating, I write about, but Eleanor Black may be one of the most fascinating characters that I found in the book, that it contained in the book, rather. Not so much because she became the first female head of the department in 1951, and in fact, the first female head of a university medical department in Canada, which was a significant achievement and got tons of press, national press in those days, Maclean's magazine, Saturday Night magazine, and so forth. But it was also that she is able to persevere against so many obstacles that had been put in her way. Eleanor was born in 1905. She lived in Nelson, BC, Calgary, and Edinburgh, Scotland for a year before her family somewhat settled in Winnipeg. Her father, Frank, worked for the United Grain Growers, and then he became a provincial politician in a sort of a progressive government. He was a conservative, however, in every other aspect of his life, and very controlling. Margaret, Eleanor's mother, Margaret, was also very distant and aloof, but that's how some parents were in those days. And I don't want to go through her whole story, only that she was told by her brother, who was a doctor, not to go into medical school. In those days, there were quota systems against minorities as well as women. Now, maybe the fact that her father was a politician helped her, but she was only one of a couple of women graduating from her class in 1930, I think it was. And she always, her whole life, one of her best lines was, she was always called a lady doctor. She said, "I'm just a doctor." And that's how she perceived herself. In some ways, she didn't mind having to come against men, but she was never always reminded the fact that she wasn't a man. Just as an example, how the world used to be, when she set up her own private practice, in those days, the government sort of partially paid doctors or set a fee, plus they could charge other things. She went to the bank because she was in the middle of the Depression. She didn't really have any money. She asked the bank for a loan to help her get her practice off the ground. Without telling her, the bank manager phoned her father, and who didn't know anything about it, and asked his permission to give his daughter a loan. She, of course, was so angry about it. Her father was angry with her, but eventually she got enough sufficient funds to get her practice going. And then she continued. And then by the time 1951 came along, she had led the hospital through the flood of 1950, just when the now old Women's and Maternity Pavilion was open. She was spearheaded some of that, and that took many, many years of lobbying from the government to get it done. Similar, and not a lot changes, by the way, in the history of Manitoba healthcare. I can assure you, the same problems have existed for, I don't know, about 60 years. And they still haven't been solved, and we're sort of fighting the same fight. But in any event, when she was appointed, she was between her and another male member of the department, and I have to say that it was a pretty big deal that they decided to choose her, and then that's but then it took decades. Maggie Morris was the next female head of the department, and that took many, many, many years after that. So anyways, you can read more about Eleanor. She was very interesting. Near the end of her career, she really couldn't handle the hippie med students. Somebody came to class wearing sandals, and she liked to kick the guy out, long hair, long. So she was a little conservative and traditional that way. But anyways, she's just one of the very fascinating people in the book. There's also, I have a chapter about the abortion issue in Manitoba, which is also interesting, fascinating, tragic shooting of Dr. Feynman, if you remember that story. So I mean, that's a whole issue also that REN is a social political issue that was very much a factor in all of this. Richard Borditsky's story deals with the development of birth control and sex education and that whole aspect, which she also ran into many obstacles in order to get going. So I hope you enjoy it, and thank you again for coming, and thank you to the department for asking me to do this. I greatly appreciate it. And I think now Dr. Poliquin is going to come up and say a few words. Thanks.
Thank you for the introduction, Allan, and thank you for inviting me to say a few words tonight, because it's a real treat to be able to share in the success of a project when the lion's share of the work has been done by those before you, namely Allan Levine and of course Dr. Mary Jane Seeger in her role as department head of Obstetrics, Gynecology and Reproductive Sciences. I've had the privilege to take a sneak peek at Allan's book, and I've had the opportunity to savor the first few chapters, all the way up to Eleanor Black's tenure as department chair. And as an obstetrician myself, I'm evidently biased, but as I read the history of maternity care in our province, I'm fascinated by how much obstetrics itself, or sometimes a lack thereof, has shaped history as we know it. I wonder if any other singular discipline in medicine has influenced the construction of monuments, such as the Taj Mahal, or altered the course of quite so many monarchies. But Allan, where I especially tip my hat to you is how digestible your style reads. This book is far from a dry history textbook. Your writing tells the stories of our former department members so exquisitely that I can imagine training under them. I hope that I wasn't the medical student with the sandals. And I can appreciate many of their idiosyncrasies. You have a gift for telling the story as though you were a fly on the wall of every maternity ward and gynecological ward for the past century and a half. So thank you for listening to, reading about, and telling the story of our department. As a sign of our appreciation, I would like to present you with a small token made in Manitoba to thank you for telling the story of obstetrics and gynecology in Manitoba. This is a pen crafted by a local artisan, Marc Gagnon, and we offer it to you in hopes that you'll continue to put pen to paper for many years to come. We'd also like to thank our publishers, Heartland Associates, because without you, this project could not have come to fruition. And finally, while Allan's book most certainly is a history about obstetrics and gynecology, I was surprised to discover that it's also a fairly comprehensive illustrative history of men's facial hair through the past century and a half. And this was perhaps most handsomely demonstrated by Dr. Richard Borditzky, who I hope is tuned in today. And he models stylishly not only one, but 3 different trends over the decades featured on pages 82, 93, and 95. But kidding aside, we're very much here today because of Dr. Mary Jane Seeger and Dr. Richard Borditzky's passion. Both have equal parts wisdom and love for our department, and enough to know that it was time to bind the stories of our department together between 2 book covers. So thank you again, and thank all of you for coming out in support of Allan's book and our department. And I think I'm turning things over now to Mr. Taves so he can tell us how Allan will be transported to the moving hatch. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holliday. I wish it were more dramatic. We will, however, just have Allan wander over to the table where I will accompany him. And in just a moment, you'll be free to wander over and have a copy of tonight's book signed. Now, we do have copies available at the table itself. We also have copies available at our central cash desk. If you'd like to pop up there and request one, you can get your book signed before you pay for it. All we ask is that you do pay for your book at some point this evening before you leave. We're very grateful to everybody in the department for helping to make this book a reality, to all at Heartland Associates as well for publishing this book, and of course to all of tonight's speakers, Dr. Seeger, Dr. Paula Quinn, and the book's author, Allan Levine. So please join me in thanking them one final time this evening, and thank you for joining us.